Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. And yet, I ask you, is not an alien force already among us?
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
In my association with Project Blue, they definitely withheld information.
The whole fleet of them was on the ASA. They're all going against the wind. The wind's 120 knots.
You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Do you believe that our government is in possession of UAPs?
Absolutely.
Everybody, welcome back to Total Disclosure, and today we are presented to you specific by BioMind, supplied by Adentia Herbals. It's a new supplement that I've been taking that includes a variety performance mushrooms and other things like lion's mane that really promote neuron health and growth. It's been an absolute game changer for me and my lifestyle, and all the links for that will be in the description below, as well as all of our other advertisers. And don't forget, if you want to get access to early interviews, ad-free content, and all that good stuff, bonus material. Like I said, we're working on a film right now. So all the behind scenes footage for that is going to members only. Click join if you're watching on YouTube. And if you're listening on any platform like Apple or Spotify, leaving a review really helps, especially on those platforms. It helps us get to a wider variety of an audience to be able to do more fun and engaging stuff like going out to remote places. So with that being said, let's not waste too much time. Tonight, I am so appreciative that I get to hit with one of my favorite people, and that's Graeme Rendall. He is an aviation enthusiast, World War II enthusiast, German secret weapons enthusiast, and just a UFO enthusiast. I mean, what comes with aviation comes with the unidentified. So all from an early age, and he's been interested in all of these things. So I think it all culminated together, and that he has become a leading authority, especially when it comes to historical cases in modern day ufology. He's written 5 UFO related books so far. I mean, he seems like he's cranking them out weekly at this point, and they're all available on Amazon. All the links will be in the description below. All right, Graeme. Nice to have you on the show.
Hi, Tyler. Thanks for the invitation.
Oh, of course.
I
would not be doing my job as a podcaster in ufology in this crazy world that we live in if I did not get to speak to you at least once. And I hope this is the beginning of a longer discussion. And I'm super excited that you're here. I know that phrase, leading authority, might be something that you don't like to hear, or you're not. It might bug you a little bit, but you've been in this field for almost 50 years, 45, 50 years. I think you've earned the title.
Yeah, I mean, I've been interested in it for 50 years. I mean, I wouldn't say I've been sort of like really active, because obviously when you're a kid, you can only read about the subject. It's only when you get a bit older and you have a bit more, the tools and the wherewithal to be able to start looking into it, to the subject as a whole. You start to learn more. You start to develop, friendships with other people, relationships with others, and just get into the nitty gritty of it all. And in just actually the last few years, I've only had the time, the space, and the enthusiasm to actually write about it. So it's been a bit of a process over those 50 years. But yes, I've definitely been interested in the subject for 5 decades. I am that old.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of people that came in to not me. I mean, came into the UFO community. I mean, I wasn't active on like Twitter with UFOs or anything like that because the podcast originally was about movies and I interviewed actors and it was only, I mean, I had a UFO sighting when I was 10 to 12 years old,
Yeah.
right in the front of my house, in the front of my parents' house. And I mean, clear as day, man, the classic. I mean, it just came right over my head, treetop level, right? Oscillating with 3 prominent circles on the bottom, moving forward, right over my head. I mean, I grew up next to, like, not even 3 minutes from me is something I can't even explain, to have the time to explain to you now. There's that, but there's also one of Raytheon used to have a huge place, a huge building in the technology park that's literally spitting distance to here. And also, I grew up, there's a Air Force base not even 20 minutes from here. So could what I have saw been something prosaic? Absolutely. But I remember it being so out there. And this is when the internet didn't exist. And that's what I want to talk about is how did you do all this pre-internet? Like, how did you network with other people?
I think
conferences?
Yeah, the networking came later. I mean, in the early days, it was simply reading as much as I could. Pretty much not all the time, but every time I had a spare hour, or I had time in the library, I'd be pulling books out of the library because this is a day when that's how you learn things.
Right.
Either you were given books yourself for Christmas or birthday presents. The few bookshops that were around. Also new bookshops because secondhand bookshops. It was still hard to find UFO titles back in those days, but the library was always the best source. Even my local library in a suburb of a city in northern England had a shelf of maybe 20 or 30 UFO books, and this was probably in 1973, 1974. So that's going back quite a long way. And then the city library itself had maybe 2 or 3 times that in its collection as well. And then secondhand bookshops, you could get occasionally, you'd see something come in that would be something that the libraries didn't have. But even as a naive kind of like sort of 10-year-old and early teenager, I didn't really have the kind of capacity to sort of sign up to newsletters because I didn't know they existed. And the books very rarely gave details of these kind of things. Or if they did, they were American, they weren't British, and they certainly weren't ones in the north of England, which is, far removed from London. We're 300 miles from London. So you don't have that kind of, the same kind of culture
archive
down there. And the access to information, it was quite a bit of a poor part of the country, if you like. Starved of investment, starved of jobs, all this kind of stuff. So, it was quite difficult. But as time went on, and then you got the first dial-up connections in terms of the internet. So we're talking about sort of early to mid 90s. There was bulletin boards, and some of the early bulletin boards on Usenet, if people can remember that far back, a lot of them were to do with UFOs. So I joined them when I got my first PC. But before that, I was buying UFO magazines because they were actually commercially available. Monthly magazines in the UK, or one in particular called, not surprisingly, UFO Magazine.
Right on the money.
Not to be confused with the American title of the same name, which some people also might remember. And of course, there were things like Flying Saucer Review, which you could subscribe to. But some of them were relatively expensive for somebody who was only living on pocket money. So
especially getting it shipped. A lot of them being based in the United States.
Yeah, and I mean, I only ever came across things like APRO, by reading UFO books, and to me that was just like 4 letters. I didn't even know what it meant to start with. I didn't realize, what it stood for. I didn't realize the Lorenzans were part of it. I didn't realize that it was a long-running organization, with lots of members, and people used to send stuff into them. But I just saw it as like a footnote in a lot of these books, and just wondered what it was because it was always this really good source of information. But then again, things like True Magazine and Fate Magazine were also always, coming up in the footnotes, if there were any footnotes in books, because a lot of them didn't have that kind of thing, which I'm really strong on in my own work, because I believe
You are.
people should try and see your homework. They should see where you're getting your information from. But these things always fascinated me back then, because I didn't know what these magazines were, and I'd never seen copies of them. It was only later that I managed to either source them or see digital copies as well, also recently. So they were a bit of a mystery as well, not just interesting, but quite mysterious, and a little bit it was almost like an El Dorado, kind of thing.
Yeah,
I've got to get copies of these. So there was all that going on. Pre-internet days weren't fun in terms of getting information. I mean, certainly it's not like today. People are spoilt today.
They don't even realize how spoiled they are, and that's why, like, especially with some of these historical cases. Now, don't get me wrong. Modern day, I'm talking modern day, like 2024, not 2024, Jesus, 2004 on, like Nimitz on. Don't get me wrong. The cases are, they're good. Photography is better, all that. But these historical cases, people forget how limited the technological landscape was on the side of citizenship. So the average person didn't have the information available to them to make these certain aspects up. Like we see with today, everybody knows what a gray is. Everybody knows, even if you're not familiar with UFOs and ufology, you know what a gray alien
culture is there, isn't it? It's also been ingrained into people's social landscape. So you don't have to be interested in ufology to know what a gray looks like, or a black triangle. Everybody knows what Area 51 is. They might not know what it is in detail, but they'll have heard of it, and they'll have something, some kind of idea associated with it, what it is. So and you just mentioned the word Roswell, and people all automatically think aliens, crashed spacecraft, secret recoveries and all the rest of it, because they've either seen a documentary or they've read something in a newspaper, even if it's just a brief article. And that's part of part of the overall psyche. So you're right. Certain things do sort of are quite long lived, even though people might not know a huge amount about them.
Absolutely. And pop cultures have obviously played a huge part in that. And I don't think that is necessarily a bad thing, but it hasn't really helped the topic as much as you'd think it might. Because I mean, everyone's got this fascination with these right now, at least, with these two different disclosures: the catastrophic disclosure and the controlled disclosure. I was just watching Neil's Saul Foundation presentation, and I mean, he talks about the difference in the definitions of each, and it's all good and good and well, and I don't know what you took of some of those videos, and if you watched them from the Saul Foundation, but I would love to get your perspective on some of them, but at a future date. So what? All right. So Graeme, what got you into being an aviation enthusiast? Because I assume it starts there, and with aviation comes unidentified aviation, and the gap is right there. I mean,
so the start point for the aviation, the start point of the ufology, probably only maybe 5 or 6 years apart. They're not that far apart when I was a kid. So even at the age of 4, I knew what airplanes were, because we lived fairly close to the flight path of the international airport for the city where I lived. The flight path was only maybe 2 miles away, so you could see airplanes coming in. Sometimes they flew over the house, depending on what kind of circuit they were flying, especially the smaller stuff. So it was you saw airplanes pretty much every day. And I certainly remember one day in the schoolyard, which was just in the back of the house where I lived in back then. and these 4 jet interceptors, they were called Lightnings, and they took off almost together in formation. And then as soon as they got so far off the end of the runway, they basically just went vertical, because that was one of the things they used to do back then. They put they go almost supersonic,
Wow.
not quite, but they put the engine into afterburner and then just shoot off in a vertical climb till they got to the operating altitude. Then they would just shoot off to wherever they were going for whatever exercise they were flying. But the noise, these
Right.
and these 1960 or late 1950s, early 1960s era jets. Which I was watching probably 1970, 1971 maybe. The kids in the schoolyard all stopped playing and just looked up in the skies at these things. And you saw them, and you saw these big triangular jet bombers called the Vulcan, which was a big delta wing aircraft. You couldn't miss those, and the power and the noise of those things when they came thundering over as well. So there was a steady stream of airplanes back then. It was the middle of the Cold War. We had a lot more military aircraft in Britain than we do now, and they were constantly flying exercises or training missions. So you always saw them either when I was at home or when I was out and about. And because I didn't live far from the airport, it was also a convenient place. So sometimes my father would take me out and we'd sit at the end of the runway and watch the planes. So just for maybe an hour, just to kill an hour or so if we were coming back that way from somewhere else. So I was introduced to airplanes at quite an early age. But another thing was I used to be bought model aircraft kits to keep me quiet at home, because it was a great thing for a kid. Give them a model kit, some glue, and a quiet place to work, and then you've got somebody quiet for hours. And I used to hang the finished items from my bedroom ceiling, so I had like a little air force above my bed. And of course the instructions for these models had a little potted history of the type of airplane that you were building. So I started to build up a little bit of knowledge about the airplanes themselves. But being a bit of a sponge back then, the library again got me more information about the airplanes. So I started learning much more. And even at an early age, I was a bit of a reader. I'd learned to read before I went to school. So I was straight into books which are probably aimed at adults, but I was still reading things like that. Some of the stuff went over my head, but as I got older and older, I was starting to pick up a hell of a lot more. So that's how the aviation bit started. And then by sort of 8 or 9 years old, I was reading science fiction novels. And these from some of the classic authors from the 50s and 60s. And they also, the paperback novels had nice pictures of spacecraft on the front. The artwork was obviously designed to entice the reader. And my mother, who's long dead now, but she bought another book for me, thinking it was another one of these science fiction novels, but it wasn't. It was a book on flying saucers. It had a picture of a flying saucer on the front. But
so it was like a book of case studies, or
it was a book called Mysterious Visitors. It was by an author called Brinsley LaPoe Trench, which some of your audience might have heard of. And that got me hooked. So I was already interested in airplanes, and some of the cases involved airplanes as well that were in the book. But it was just one of these things where I'd never come across anything like this before. I mean, I'd seen science fiction films on television, but it was nothing like kind of things. Yeah, it was nothing like something that was supposed to be fact. Because if I was reading a book, then being quite naive back when you're 9-year-old, anything that you read in a book must be fact, unless it's, of course, a novel. So it was a kind of
it kind of bridged the gap. It bridged the gap between. So it's funny because I say this all the time, is we're like, most of us grow up and we're taught that the world is very black and white, right? It's not till later on that we find that there's much more gray than we ever could imagine. And it seems like you kind of got that at a younger age than most of us.
But also it was something that I wasn't being taught at school. You were taught like history, geography, science, French, all the standard
pyramids,
subjects.
All that.
But nothing like this. And I'm thinking, well, hold on, who else knows about this kind of stuff? And it wasn't something I could ask my mother and father about, because they had no idea. It wasn't something they were aware of. My friends didn't really know that much about the subject either. And teachers. It was that kind of school, that kind of time where you couldn't relate to your teachers. You couldn't necessarily have a good conversation with them, that you might be able to do that nowadays. It was a different kind of era you were quite set apart from your teachers. They were from a different generation. A lot of them were quite
Old
strict. They were
school.
authoritarian. Yeah, they were old school. Yeah, the phrase. They were authoritarian. So you couldn't just rock up to them and have a conversation about something as weird as this.
Yeah, I mean,
and get any kind of
my
meaningful conversation from them.
my uncle, he went to, I'm not to say this in a bad way, but he's about your age, and he's left-handed naturally, but he said that in school they said that left-handedness was like something demonic, and they would slap his hand with a ruler and force him to write with his right hand.
Yeah.
Like stuff like that.
My dad was also the same as that. He was left-handed when he was a child, and he grew up in the late 20s, early 30s, and he had the same thing back then, the same attitude. If you were left-handed, you had to write with your
I'm
right.
left-handed.
So he basically became ambidextrous because he was forced to write at school with his right hand, but he was naturally left-handed. So when he grew up, he could write with either hand. It was just the way it was instilled into him.
It's crazy how times change, right? And it's all
definitely.
And like that, that's why I'm so fascinated with you, because I really want to talk about. I mean, let's paint it for what it is. I mean, you're a leading authority on UFOs, especially historical cases, and the progression of what I would call modern day ufology post 1900, or what we call modern. I do want to ask you one question before we go down that path. Do you think there's a possibility that it's been happening much longer? Let's just say, get the elephant out of the room, or not elephant out of the room, but let's call it what it is: the ancient astronaut hypothesis. Do you subscribe to any part of that?
I can't discount it.
Okay.
I must admit that in terms of how much there is to it, I haven't looked at all of it. I've seen documentaries. I've read a few books on the subject. I've obviously, Eric von Daniken was required reading back in the 70s when his books came out,
absolutely.
which I owned back then, from an early age. So it's not as if I'm not aware of all that stuff, but I don't know. It's one of those things where I'm still neither. Sort of like I just don't know, and I think that's a hard thing for a lot of people to say. I think some people will try and fit theories into square pegs into round holes and try to come up with with an answer. Whereas I'm happy just to say I don't know when I don't know. In terms of being in terms of a long time, yeah, I mean the stories going back to like times of Alexander the Great, flaming shields over battlefields and things like that. So if you take those stories as being either halfway true, then it seems like the phenomenon has been with humans for a long, long time. And then, of course, you've got various things from medieval times and from later on. If you believe things like woodcuts and early paintings that have things that could be construed as UFOs. Now, it might just be the way that the imagery of certain other things were depicted back in those days. I think the jury's still out with a lot of that. And again, it comes down to who is looking at it and what kind of narrative you're trying to push and how you interpret these symbols as to what they are. And unfortunately now we're so far removed from these times that we can't really, sort of ask the people who came up with these icons, these pictures, these images, these paintings, etc. So we don't know. We're trying to put a modern kind of spin, if you like, on much earlier things. It gets a bit easier when you get to a more, like as you were saying, sort of after 1900. But even going back to the late 1800s and the airship saga, if you like, in America, where that was a case of one of maybe the first times where the technology that was being seen or being reported on and being witnessed was probably just a little bit more advanced than what people were capable of at the time. And it's that kind of technological gap which to me is the interesting bit and was interesting to me at an early age, because the things I was reading about back in the 70s of things that had been happening maybe 30, 40, 50, sometimes years beforehand, the gap between what was possible, humanity had at its fingertips, if you like, in terms of airplanes, rockets, etc., and whatever was being described in terms of what people were seeing, there was a bit of a gulf there, and that kind of gulf was what got me interested in so much as, okay, well, what are these things? If we can't build them, then where they're from? Who's flying these things?
Right.
What motives do they have, and all this kind of stuff. So
Absolutely.
that interested me really early on as to why this stuff's different.
I like that. So I want to start here. I mean, the Cold War, we'll get to it. But I want to start with the Foo Fighters.
Okay.
You wrote a book about them.
I did.
I mean, I think it's fair to say that we should start there. And then I want to get into Hitler, the Third Reich, and their, secret science division, a search for a way to win the war, Operation High Jump, that kind of stuff. So I want to begin there, and I know that's a lot,
Okay.
but
No, it's fine. It's fine.
can you tell our viewers what because aside from the band that everybody knows, which actually they named their band that in inspiration of these things, can you explain what a Foo Fighter is and when we were seeing them and why they're a part of history?
Okay, well, so I'll answer that question just in a little bit, but I'll probably expand it a bit just to talk about UFOs and World War II generally, because it's actually important to get a bit of context just to see where the Foo Fighters fit in, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
So yeah, as you say, I wrote a book about the World War II UFO phenomenon, and it was called UFOs Before Roswell, European Foo Fighters 1940 to 1945, which gives your audience a bit of an idea, what the book was about. So yeah, UFOs were seen throughout World War II, not just at the end of the war when the Foo Fighters became a phenomenon. People have been seeing all sorts of shapes and sizes in terms of craft, not just lights in the sky. So these were things that were torpedo-shaped objects. Some of them were different shapes, but a lot of the time they were just lights, and lights that followed airplanes. Now, the Royal Air Force have been reporting these things since about 1940. And some of the intelligence documents that I've sort of turned up from the National Archives in Britain that few of any people have actually looked at talk about lights that follow aircraft for up to 250 miles in some cases. So that's quite a long way. And
that is so long.
Yeah. So the bomber commands, that's the Royal Air Force's bomber command, they're what they call the Operational Research Section, which were tasked with looking at types of German measures in terms of trying to shoot down our bombers. They were looking at this kind of thing for quite early on, from about the summer of 1940, when this started. And they looked at it for about 2 years, trying to work out what was going on. And to the end, they just gave up. Obviously, they thought there was some kind of German weapon or some kind of German tactics on behalf of the Night Fighter Force, but they couldn't get to the bottom of it. So after a couple of years, they just thought they were wasting their time. So they moved on to other things. But the reports still kept coming in. And then, of course, when the Americans joined the war in Europe and their bombing raids over Germany started in January 1943, then the Americans the crews started seeing strange things during the daytime as well. Bear in mind, the RAF bomber crews over Germany were mostly flying at night. So yeah, things were seen, by day and by night, but not just over Germany. They were seen over Holland. They were seen over France. They were seen over the Bay of Biscay. They were seen over Italy, over the Balkans, over the Eastern Front. So that straight away you can see it's not just a small part of Europe. Then you fast forward to actually the beginning of 1944, and things which would later be called the Foo Fighters are seen much more regularly. They're reported over the Mediterranean. They're reported over the Balkans by RAF bomber crews attacking targets in Romania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, those kind of places. And they are literally balls of light which follow airplanes, sometimes even 6 surrounding an airplane in one particular account. And these accounts are buried away in the squadron archives. So you look for, the mission reports from bombing raids, and you see references to things like this. It's just a question of going through them, bit by bit. And not many people, in fact, I'm the first person to have looked through a lot of these squadron records, because some of the things I was pulling out had never been published before by anybody.
Really?
They'd never been found before by anybody. Some work has been done, and some really good work has been done in terms of some of the American squadrons. But in terms of the RAF side of it, not so much. possibly because the authors of works beforehand were American, so they had access to the American side and not so much for the British. But nevertheless, it's quite a good thing to build further research on. So some of the stuff I was coming up with, never seen the light of day before, but it just basically builds up a picture that these things were increasing. And then of course you get to about October. Now the recognized start of the Foo Fighter phenomenon is November, but actually in October 1944, night fighter crews from the US Army Air Force based in Europe, so they were based in Belgium and based in France, they were starting to report being followed by these red balls of light at night.
Red balls of light.
And then one of the radar operators from the 415th Night Fighter Squadron, a guy called Donald Myers, he came up with a name of Foo Fighters because he was interested in comic books. And there was one particular comic strip in particular, which was Smokey Stover, which was a comic firefighter, sorry. And he drove around in something called the Foo-mobile. And his catchphrase was, "Where there's foo, there's fire." So it was a kind of corruption of all these things in this comic book that Donald Myers actually came up with the name Foo Fighters. And the story goes that when he first reported one of the followings, if you like, he went to the intelligence officer of this particular squadron. And when he was asked about what these things were, he got the comic book out of his back pocket and slammed it down on the intelligence officer's desk and said, "It's another one of those Foo Fighters." You used a swear word beforehand, but so there you go. So that's how the name came about, and it spread throughout the squadron. It also spread to another squadron, the 422nd, which was based in another part of Europe at the time, Western Europe at the time. But then the name actually went across to Italy as well, because in northern Italy, there was a couple of night fighter squadrons based there as well, the 414th and the 416th. And they were also seeing the same kind of thing. And that name actually spread to them in February 45. But they've been saying the same kind of thing the previous year as well, and actually in the previous summer in 44. So you can see that these things were being witnessed, they were being reported, even if the name Foo Fighters wasn't being used. But that was the kind of catch-all term that applied for everything from about the last week in November in the official reporting. And you'll see that name crop up in squadron reports of missions, Foo Fighter, etc. And it just keeps coming up. And they got the point where there were so many of these cases that intelligence officer I mentioned before, he started compiling a list because he thought, I've got to do something with this information. I've got to send it up the chain of command.
Absolutely.
So he came up with a list of 14 different cases. And that was only a very small number of what was actually going on.
And is it fair to say that everybody thought it was everybody else?
Oh, yeah. Well, what else would it be? If you were an intelligence analyst back then and, something strange that you'd never seen before, that you couldn't work out what it was, then it had to be a German secret weapon. And all the intelligence, all the kind of intelligence analysis, all the scientists that got in, all the rest of it to try and look at this stuff, that's basically what they came up with. It was either they're seeing things or the German secret weapons. And that's how they still thought at the end of the war, when the final kind of determination, when they got the final word, because the Americans didn't know what it was. And they then passed the request of, can you tell us what this is, to the British Air Ministry, because they were considered to be the last word, if you like. And it took them about maybe a month and a half to come up with the answer. And the answer was, they're jet fighters or they're some kind of flak rocket. Well, if you look at the reports, there were neither of those things.
Is it? Now, I only bring this up because I swear, I think it was Nick Pope. He had said that there was a communication between Winston Churchill and, was it Eisenhower?
Oh, I've heard this story before. So
would it have been Eisenhower?
So I'll tell you how this story comes out.
Okay.
In one of the releases from the National Archives back in the 2000s, there was a collection of letters that a scientist, he was working on, I think, might have been like one of the space programs in Britain, one of the small kind of, we have like people who build satellites,
Like
launched by other countries.
early space development.
No. It's Leicester University, I believe. They have the kind of division where they build satellites and they teach people to build satellites, but they're launched by you guys and the European Space Agency, that kind of thing. It's a very small operation, but it exists in Britain. Now, this guy, I think he was attached to one of these things, but that's not the issue. What he said was that his mother had told him a story about his grandfather, and his grandfather was supposed to be a guard at the War Office, where Churchill, the underground, one of the underground bunkers where Churchill met all his advisors, etc., during the war. So this is under 10 Downing Street, if you like, in the war rooms underneath Parliament during the war. So this is not just a first, like a kind of, this is somebody told me this story. It's also not just a second-hand story; it's a third-hand story.
Right.
Okay. So the story was that this guard was present at a meeting where Churchill was supposedly in late 1944 was supposed to have been given details of a Mosquito fighter bomber coming back from Europe over the North Sea and being chased by a ball of light.
Right.
Okay. And therefore, when the news got to Churchill, he then said, "This can't get out. We must keep it secret because it'll panic this, that, and the other, all this kind of stuff."
We're already under.
And that's how it's supposed. Now, that story has never been corroborated. Again, it's basically somebody telling somebody about something somebody told them. So it's like kind of Chinese whispers. There was never any release about who it was. There was no information you can chase up. It was just he said, she said. And also, if there was a guard, he wouldn't have been present in the room itself. He would have been outside the room because these meetings were secret. You had a guard posted on the outside of the doors, not inside.
Yeah,
the doors.
not inside.
Yeah, exactly.
He doesn't have the clearance.
There's a lot of stuff doesn't add up with this tale.
And that's what pisses me off. I am super sorry that I interrupted the great Graeme Rendall. But
don't worry about it.
It pisses me off because people like Nick Pope, and I'm not, listen, this is not a dig at Nick Pope. I actually like him, but he tells some stories, and because people see him as a former,
they think it's true.
The insider, they take it as fact.
I mean, to be honest, it's factual in so much as the letters are in the archives. But unfortunately, the papers, when they got wind of this, when those documents were released in whichever year it was, the papers basically go on the premise that that's true. Yeah, and also everybody else that seems to comment on this story, because I keep getting questions about it every so often. Well, do you not know that Churchill banned all talk about the Foo Fighters? Well, it's not true because we don't know if he did or not. It seems, it's one of those stories where it's got legs because it keeps getting kind of, people like obviously you've just asked it as well. So, it's out there as it's like an urban myth, but it's got no provenance whatsoever. It is literally somebody who said, my dad, my father told me this, I'm now passing this story to you. And we don't know how true it is.
Right.
It's just one of those things where it's literally the words of somebody who told somebody else something. And which may or may not be true.
And what sucks to say is 90 to 94% of this ufology, like the stories, that's what people see is uncorroborated stories.
So he asked. So when you look at the letters again, he is basically asking whether there are any official records of the meeting, and if so, what was discussed. And of course, the MOD, the Ministry of Defence, can't find anything because there probably wasn't a meeting along these lines. I mean, all the minutes, all those kind of meetings were minuted. Now, whether or not some of them are still secret is another question. But there's never been anything. And my response to this, and actually something because I devoted a chapter to this particular topic in the book that I wrote about the Foo Fighters.
Yeah.
And my argument is there were so many other stories that happened before this case is alleged to have occurred. So I'm going back to 1942, where an object was actually shot at by a bomber. And then there are other stories of 200-foot-long torpedo-shaped objects being seen by bomber crews over Italy in 1942. Though that last case was actually sent up the chain of command, a report was sent up to the higher echelons of bomber command. Now, if anything would have got to Churchill, it would have been these cases from 2 years earlier. So why did it take until 1944 for just like an innocuous case, like some lights following an airplane when nothing was shot at? And it wasn't something huge. Why did it take that for him to go, oh no, we're going to not talk about this anymore? It just doesn't make sense to me. So that's why I don't actually believe it. I don't believe it.
The way you just painted that, it makes so much more sense that because if I'm kinetically engaging, that is big, right? You don't just shoot at things in the sky without having to explain why you did so. And that would have eventually some sort of, I am shooting at something I can't identify in the sky. I don't know if it's foreign. That would have made its way to Churchill by then.
And it's not clear exactly when in 1944 this particular case is supposed to have happened, because the actual kind of details of this alleged case, and I'm going to use that word in inverted commas, alleged case that turns out in this Churchill story. You say there's nothing that you can actually look into it about. You don't know the squadron, you don't know the date, you don't know the unit, you don't know any of the crew details. You know nothing beyond it's supposed to have been a Mosquito, but we don't even know that's true.
Right.
But let's say, for argument's sake, it's the beginning in 1944. We'd had several cases by then of things being shot at, and in one particular case, the bullets going into it and nothing happening. There were cases of huge wingless objects following bombers. I'll come back to that if you want.
I'm sorry. Did you just say they were absorbing the artillery?
Yeah. According to the person, according to the pilot, that's what happened. And then also over North Africa, things being shot at by fighter bomber pilots as well. And then other engagements where they were being chased in circles by these lights. Now, all these stories add up. There are story after story. Sometimes you're probably getting into dozens, sometimes maybe even hundreds of cases by the time this case in 1944 is supposed to have happened. So somewhere along the line, Churchill, if it had been so important, he would have known about it by then. So that's why I fail to kind of sort of put any credence behind this particular story. But as I said before, it's everywhere. The news stories keep coming back to it and quoting it as being fact when it's nothing of the sort. And unfortunately, that's the kind of thing that bedevils ufology.
But is it safe to say that there is a possibility, whether it be 1944 or before, that they might have reached out to the United States and asked, hey, we're dealing with these things. We want to know if you are.
Oh, yeah.
Is it plausible that it
well,
could
we know that happened already, because intelligence reports from the RAF and from the United States Army Air Force were actually sent to each other. They were copied to each other. So if you look on the historical records sort of agency in America for the United States Air Force, you can find microfilms that actually have copies of RAF intelligence documents on them. So we know they were passed to the Air Force, your side. And similarly, US Air Force reports, 8th Air Force, the squadrons, and also from the 9th Air Force, the bomber squadrons that were based in England, flying against Germany and the continent. We know that their intelligence documents were also passed to the RAF, because everybody had to know about what everybody else was seeing in terms of German defenses. And that's the reason why these reports were passed on, because you didn't want to have not all the information at your fingertips. If you were flying, against the enemy, you needed to know what everybody else knew about their defenses. And of course, these things were considered to be possibly part of the German defenses.
Wow. I'm just kind of taken back a little bit. A few times on the show, I think I've been a little speechless, because what would all right, we have the Foo Fighters, and a lot of people describe them as just balls of light.
Yep.
Now, were there any other encounters with different shaped objects? Or because a lot of people think that UFOs are disc shaped often, but I would say that that's not the truth. There's so many accounts of cigar shaped, propane tank,
Tic-tac.
shaped tic tac.
Yep.
Just as much. So, do you think these Foo Fighters were circular balls of light, or were they something different, or were there multiple?
So one of the questions, when the information about the Foo Fighters, I mentioned that list before that this intelligence officer compiled, when that was sent up the chain of command, one of the questions that came back to him effectively was, what part of the aircraft are these lights attached to? And that was one of the things that was asked, because they assumed that these lights were just like navigation lights or headlights or something like that. But it turned out that they weren't attached to anything. They were literally just lights. There was nothing behind them. There was no airframe. There was no apparatus. There was nothing that they were actually fixed to. They were just lights. And the way these things were maneuvering and being able to follow airplanes, even when airplanes were throwing, diving and turning and all the rest of it, evasive maneuvers, these things were just managing to sit on their tails. And story after story, not just the Americans, but also the British beforehand, they were just lights. The RAF had a different name, pilots had a different name for these Foo Fighters. They called them the Thing or the Light. And that name had been coined as early as 1943 and maybe even beforehand. So you'll see in pilot logbooks occasionally reference to those things, the names, but also not just lights. I mentioned there was a huge wingless object came up behind an anti-submarine airplane on the Bay of Biscay. And that was an American airplane, by the way, and that was November 1942. There was a 200 or 300 foot long torpedo-shaped object seen by a bomber crew over northern Italy. So that, you could call that a tic-tac. That's your cigar-shaped object. And other things like that were seen and reported. Some things were classed as rockets, but they were flying zigzags. And a rocket can't do that. Rockets follow ballistic trajectories. They don't zigzag.
No.
Whereas a lot of these things that were seen over the skies of Europe following bombers would follow in what they called a series of jerks. So they would zigzag, or they would put spurts of speed on and then slow down again and then speed up again. So you can't reconcile that with anything that was being built at that time. There was over a battlefield in Russia at the beginning of 1943, there was something that was described as an upturned bathtub sitting above the battlefield, watching an aerial battle below it, and then the ground battle below that as well. So you've got different shapes and sizes. There's no kind of one common denominator throughout the war. The stuff that were reported after the war, all the different shapes, sizes, colors, all the rest of it, is a bit of a kind of a microcosm during the war. It's almost like an early sort of iteration of everything that happened afterwards. You even get things like flying rectangles, which were seen by a Spitfire pilot at about 20,000 feet above northern England, not too far from where I live now. That was reported. That's in the records of the unit he flew with. I've actually seen the record, how it says he saw 4 black rectangles at 22,000 feet. So yeah, you see these stories.
Rectangles.
Rectangles.
And this, it just rings that bell in my head about more modern cases that say, like, there was like a Walmart that flew over them, like it was the size of a Walmart.
Yeah, football field time size.
Football field, yeah. Like that's like those. That's what that reminds me of. And I do want to say, so Hitler in the Third Reich, they did have this, science division, and it was definitely looking for searching for a way to win the war, or at least that's
the kind of common perception,
right?
There were a lot of different companies and different competing projects in the Reich, and really, if you didn't have official patronage, so if you didn't have like a top general or some like top party boss who was on your side, then you effectively didn't really get anywhere. There weren't a lot of very small private enterprises who could get the kind of funding and the research facilities to be able to build, really specialist stuff. So it was basically the big aircraft manufacturers and some of the companies that built the tanks, the rockets, all this kind of stuff that could succeed and had the wherewithal to be able to put these things into reality, if you like. But even before the war, so just before the war started, I'm talking sort of June and or August 1939. In June 39, the Germans flew the first rocket-powered airplane. It was the world's first, the Henkel 176. And then in August 1939, just 4 days before the Second World War started, they flew the first jet aeroplane powered by a turbojet, the Henkel 178. It only flew for 6 minutes, but it was still the world's first jet flight.
Right, so, because previous to that, we're using propellers.
Well, still, yeah, that's right. And also, and not much earlier than that, a lot of the world's air forces in the mid-1930s were still flying biplanes. The RF was still flying biplane fighters about as late as 1935, 1936.
It just goes to show you that these lights that were following them, doing zigzags and doing, rock, like even our best of the best were flying planes that were lackluster, to say the least.
So there was already by the time the war started, the Germans already had the kind of capability, if not the actual desire, to immediately build jet and rocket-powered fighters. The German generals couldn't get their head around the kind of possibilities. They weren't that far-seeing. They still didn't even develop a strategic bomber force, unlike what the Americans and the British had. The big 4-engine bombers. They did have aircraft like that, but they didn't understand the potential. They were still a kind of a tactical air force, so their bombers were basically charged with the support of the army, if you like, rather than kind of strategic bombing industry and this kind of stuff. Right. But and also because of the early victories that the German army managed to get in Europe, by sort of about June 1940, there was actually a moratorium on weapons development because the Germans pretty much thought they'd won the war. They actually disbanded some army units because they thought, well, we're not going to need all these soldiers.
Really?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, they disbanded several army divisions because they just didn't need the manpower. Because France was beaten. A lot of other countries in Europe were beaten. It was only the British across the Channel who were still fighting on. By the end of 1940, the Germans had moved and they'd taken over the Balkans. They'd taken over Greece. They were, was about to start in things in North Africa in 1941. It was all kicking off, and they were effectively winning the war before they declared war on the Russians, when it all started to go a little bit wrong. But still, in the first 6 months of the war against Russia, they pushed all the way to Moscow. So things were going well for the Germans, and they didn't have the kind of, we need to get all these war-winning weapons. That came pretty much towards 1942 when things started to go a bit, badly for them. They started to get their first reversals. So El Alamein in North Africa, the British pushed back against the Germans. You had Stalingrad in Russia, which was the end of 1942, the first month of 1943. So about this time, they started to really try and push towards, well, look, what have we got on the shelf? What do we need to develop? Okay, we'll dust off the jet, the jet aircraft, and some early jet prototypes were built. There was the Henkel. They'd already built the first jet. They came up with the Henkel 280, which wasn't a success, but it paved the way for the Messerschmitt 262, which did go into service by the end of the war. It was a really good airframe, if not very good engines.
And it could stay up.
Oh yeah, it could stay up for quite a long time. It was very quick as well, and they had enough pilots trained to fly the aircraft by the end of the war, and it was quite potent when used correctly. Right. So they had decent jet aircraft. They also developed rocket-powered airplanes. The Messerschmitt 163 Comet was a rocket-powered interceptor. It wasn't very safe to fly. It wasn't very effective, but it was there. So they had the technology to do this. At the same time, sorry, go on.
Are the Germans credited with the modern day commercial airline?
Not necessarily, although they did have plans to build jet airliners after the war.
Well,
if they would.
I mean, if it wasn't for their development and then bringing those people over, through Operation Paperclip.
Paperclip, yeah.
Do you think?
Well,
I mean, could it? That's a question for another day.
yeah.
Well,
Well, actually, at the same time, Britain were developing jet engines. The Americans were doing the same. So it wasn't as if the Germans had a monopoly on this technology. They just seemed to be faster because it was more kind of like crucial for them to actually develop it before we did or before you did. And they did actually come up with the first operational jet fighter, an operational rocket-powered fighter, long before they were a thing on the British or the American side.
And let's not be, let's not be coy about it. I mean, they did have some of the best working for them.
Well, they certainly had some really and quite interesting ideas about what to do, and it's safe to say that they had a lot more stuff on paper. In terms of missiles, they had about 50 different missile designs. So whether you're talking about air to air, air to surface, or surface to air, or surface to surface, they had all these different missiles. Some managed to get into production. Obviously the famous ones that most people know about are the V1, the V2, the flying bomb, the rocket.
Yeah.
However, they also had an artillery kind of rocket. It was called the Rheinboot or the Rheinboot. They had various air-to-air missiles. One of which was almost in combat, but for the bombing of the factory that built the actual engines for this missile, it would have gone into service in early 1945. And then there were anti-tank missiles that were built as well. You had and glide bombs. That was a thing that they came out with.
Yeah.
First of all, being unpowered and then being rocket powered. So I'm talking about Fritz X, which was a glide bomb, which was radio controlled, and then the Henschel 293, which was a anti-shipping glide rocket powered anti-shipping missile. And that was wire guided first of all, and then they built a television camera into the nose so it could be TV guided. So that's really kind of, for then, cutting edge technology in 1944. So all this stuff was on the table. Some of it was actually being put into production, and it was only the fact that the war ended when it did, when some of this stuff that was some of the even more incredulous stuff that was on the drawing boards and actually just on the point of being sort of operational, the war ended before it could be put into service. And I'm talking there about vertical takeoff rocket-powered interceptors that could fly at 36,000 feet a minute in terms of a climb, and they would shoot off air-to-air rockets at bombers and then break up into bits to be parachuted back to the ground to be reused in the next mission. So this is the kind of technology they were coming up with. It was incredible, some of the stuff that they had, on their books. It's after, and this is the stuff I was really interested in as a kid,
right?
And I'm still interested in now.
Right. So I want you to bring me to why did Germany go to the Arctic?
Are we talking about the Arctic or the Antarctic? Because they're different places.
Sorry.
The Antarctic.
Sorry.
Well, you see, this is one of the things where we'll start again to come into the same realms as the Churchill story. That basically things that people have said, which then become fact, even though they're not necessarily fact. So in terms of the facts, the Germans did go to Antarctica, but they went before the war. So there was an expedition over the winter of 1938 to 1939. So it was only for like a couple of months when they sent a ship down to the Antarctic. And the only thing they did was fly aircraft over the coast, because where they turned up in Antarctica, you couldn't get a boat ashore because of big ice cliffs. So all they could do was fly some float planes from the ship that went down, because it carried 2 float planes. And they flew over the coastline, maybe 30 or 40 miles, maybe inland, and they dropped some little flags with swastikas on them to say that they'd been there. This is what you do when you go and find a new place, isn't it? You put your flag up. But because they couldn't get people ashore, that was the next best thing. So they dropped these little flags with swastikas on them, and they called it New Schwabenland. Now, from that, and that's all they did, a huge myth has basically evolved of Germans going down there and setting up a colony, and possibly during the war, and then certain people going there at the end of the war to hide, to escape the Allies, and a lot of technology going down there, to the point of where they had this huge infrastructure down there with all this, that, and the other, which was able to wipe out or force a retreat from the people in high jump, which is the US military expedition, to try and get some understanding of kind of Arctic fighting, even though it was in the Antarctic, but that was the best place to do it.
So
to try and work out how they could fight a war in the Arctic or the Antarctic in 1947.
so
So the whole story built up around that, you see.
so you don't think that there's any
No.
connection between high jump and the Germans going there,
I think when you look into it a bit more seriously,
or the Germans allegedly?
well,
going
there's
there?
there's a lot of heavy lifting going on with people's stories. There's all this kind of either it's a well-known fact that, and you see that written, or things which are basically stories presented as fact. Because if you say something long enough and hard enough, people start to believe it. But unfortunately, when you look, like a lot of things to do with the German secret weapons and a lot of myths which are on the internet, the more you actually dig into the stories and find out where the origin of the stories is, the less you find out, and you get to a point where you can't get any further back. And you tend not to be able to get back to any actually, the actual nub of the story, because it just doesn't exist.
Can I and this is this is a sub tangent, but this is my problem with religion, organized religion, is we have the same problem. It's a curation of, the Bible. Look, it's the best example. It's curated. It was put together, stories to form a narrative, and they left certain parts out that didn't align, and like it's all just stories. It's all stories, and of course, like things in the Bible that we can say, it's only when we step back and we're able to look at it as a whole picture, right, that we see that there are things in like the Bible and other texts that we can agree happened. There's evidence that for it, at least the places that they happened, and the event that happened in some cases, like the flood. And then obviously like places are being discovered, like I believe Troy. What was the found? And it was always believed to be a mythical place, and it was was it Troy?
Oh, you'd have to ask somebody else about
yeah
that.
I guess I guess that's the problem.
Yeah.
That's the problem with not having a producer. I don't have anyone to be like, hey, fact check it.
Look it up for you.
I'm not I don't have a Jamie. But anyway, some
I think
tangent over.
the things about this particular story about the Antarctic and the Germans supposed to be being there, there are some facts there, but also the way that you build a story about things, you always include some things which are true, and then you can weave your story around them, because then it muddies the issue a bit. So we know the Germans were there because that's well documented. It's the bits that people then try to make up, which they fall down because you don't have the same kind of level of documentation or witness accounts. It's basically he said, she said kind of stuff. So therefore, yes, okay, if you're trying to sell a narrative as in the Germans were in Antarctica and they did this, they did that, they had flying saucers down there, then of course you're going to try and weave a story that makes Germans being down there during the war and sending submarines down there. But actually, there's nothing to say that they ever did. German submarines did go missing, maybe is the wrong word. They were out of contact for long periods of time at the end of the war, but they all turned up. They surrendered to the Allies in different places. It wasn't as if they disappeared off the face of the earth. And yes, a lot of submarines did, were lost, but because they were lost through enemy action and that they were sunk. There's very few that they've never found.
Right.
And it's a long way to Antarctica. And really, the end of the day is, okay, you might, let's say for argument's sake, this is true, and people were sent down there. How do they survive? You can't grow food down there.
Nope.
It's a very inhospitable environment. How do you heat, the place? How do you stay warm? How do you feed yourself? How do you clothe yourself? How do you supply? How can you get enough supplies down there for fuel, for electricity, all this kind of thing? People don't think about that, So
it would have had to been a huge undertaking, in the sense that multiple voyages happen, multiple. I mean, countless
Yeah,
because
exactly.
we need to set up infrastructure, like you said. You know, and there's no evidence to suggest that
There
is
isn't,
true.
and something on that scale would have registered somewhere. The documentation or the witness
Would have
accounts would have been there
there.
in much more numbers than the few stories which are alleged to be the kind of bedrock of these tales. There
Well,
are
thank you.
some people who have said, look, certain crews who said they were submarine crew who said that this kind of thing happened. But
But
you have to
again,
read between, there are very few and far between though. So
but again, that's
a
secondhand,
lot of
third hand
and a lot of the time they
stories.
weren't directly involved.
Right.
So I look at the what evidence, and I use that again, that word advisedly, what evidence there is to actually support this idea. And I just keep coming up again and again, just saying there's not enough. It's like the German flying saucer myth, which I
So
go through at length in the book about UFOs before
I
Roswell.
was gonna bring it up, and so there's this huge,
It's a can of worms.
huge misconception about the Glock or the
Mm.
bell.
Oh, that's something else entirely. Yeah.
People, this is
Oh
different.
yeah, that's something else entirely. So you've got two different myths going on here. You
Oh,
have the bell or Die Glocke, and you also have the German flying saucer myth as well. They're two separate things.
well, if you wouldn't mind,
Okay,
but
so
we can hit
yeah,
both.
no. So if you look for Foo Fighters on the internet, sooner or later you will also come up with German flying discs, because there's a huge amount of stuff that's been, and it actually predates the internet age. It goes back to about the early 1950s, funnily enough, where some Germans started contacting various newspapers and magazines in that country in 1950, 1951, 1952 to say, I worked on this type of project. We were building flying discs. They flew such and such a place at such and such a time. Or they were building them, or they were planning to build them. It depends on who you talk, who's actually writing these things or talking to journalists. And all these stories come out in various newspapers. But when you try and dig in further, you can't go any further back. It's because that's when the stories start. And in one case, somebody said that he was a Henkel test pilot, but you can't find any record of him. Actually, what he did was he drove a truck for the U.S. Army after the war, and he delivered newspapers. That was his job. So he was supposed to be some some real clever designer who built flying discs in the war. Now, if that had been the case, he would have been snapped up by the likes of the people who were snapping up the German rocket engineers and the rocket scientists. So you weren't going to let somebody like that slip the net. And yet he was delivering newspapers for the U.S. Army. So that something doesn't figure there. There was another guy who's saying that he was part of a German technical branch who oversaw some of these projects, and he'd seen a test flight of one of these discs in February 1945, I believe it was. But again, it's one of these people who you can't trace in the war. There's no records of him, being part of anything in the war, let alone a secret or some kind of secret weapons branch. The only connection that anybody's been able to prove with rockets is that he was one of the partners of a company which built toy rockets powered by fireworks in about 1952 and 1953. So you can see where some of this is leading. A lot of people were saying a lot of things, but proving it and getting any evidence for this was a completely different thing. But these stories stayed because they were in the newspapers, and people latched onto them afterwards. And again, they're presented as fact, even though it's just somebody talking to a journalist saying, I did this, with no evidence. So yeah, it's very, very tenuous. And to say you can't trace the stories any further back than that, there's no wartime records, but people then present it as fact, and it's popped up in book after book, and it's on internet pages all over the place. And there's a lot of people who believe it, but when you try and get actual proof from them, they come up really short, and they get really angry about it as well.
So, so Die Glock,
Die Glocke, yeah.
Die Glocke in the bell.
So that's right. So that story comes from a Polish, a guy who was actually originally started writing things about secret weapons. And from what I've heard from some other people, those books aren't entirely accurate either. I do actually have a copy of one of them, and I'm trying to get it translated from Polish into English because obviously it's been a long process. I'm doing it myself. just trying so I can read, I can see for myself how accurate and how maybe inaccurate it is. But he came up with an idea. He'd allegedly, and I'm going to use this word again, he'd been given some information from somebody who had some documents from Polish intelligence just after the war, and there was allegedly an interview by Polish intelligence officers with one SS higher police leader, a guy called Jakob Sporenberg, who had allegedly, again, been part of a secret weapons program which knew about Die Glocke, which was supposed to be an anti-gravity experiment in an underground facility in Silesia, which is southern Poland nowadays. And if anybody's seen the documentary Hunt for Zero Point, then they will see this thing that looks like a henge, looks like a these kind of stilts in a circle. And that was, according to this Polish author, was supposed to be the basis of a test rig for an anti-gravity device called the bell, because it was supposed to be shaped like a bell. His sole, as far as I can tell, his sole evidence for this comes from these transcripts from this interview in about 1946, 1947, maybe, from Polish intelligence and this former SS officer. Now, this SS officer, you can trace his history. You know where he was at certain times during the war, and he wasn't in Poland towards the end of the war. He was in Norway because he'd been banished there for some transgression or other in 1944.
Another hole.
So at the end of the war, he wasn't actually anywhere near this project, and it's debatable as to how much kind of knowledge he, as somebody in his position, bearing in mind he was effectively a kind of like a top policeman, if you like, was more concentrating on sorting out the Jewish question as it was then, or getting rid of partisans, etc., rather than being interested in a secret weapons project. Because actually the SS at the end of 1944 weren't even into the secret weapons project. They only took over the German secret weapons programs at the end of January 1945, and that's Kammler, his doing. So in 1944 they weren't really into it in terms of officially. But again, it's one of these things where you can weave a story around all sorts of things and make it sound really good. And if you have a little bit of knowledge about, to say, oh, I've got this information, it was from a secret source, an anonymous source, and about this, that, and the other, which you can't disprove, you can't prove a negative, and you can purport this fact and then build a whole narrative around it. You're made, basically. I'm sure if I had a mind to it, I could probably come up with something really, really kind of, sort of believable. But well, why would I do it? It just destroys your credibility as far as I'm concerned. So I don't believe it, I'm afraid. There's never been anything presented to me about that entire story that I can go, yeah, I believe that.
Okay, and that fair enough. Honestly, the points you make and the evidence, because I know you have done the work. I trust you, and now it just kind of sheds light that these are just stories, and maybe in some scenarios are used to tell people like me who want to believe, right?
Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, so they serve a purpose in so much as it serve a purpose as if they're an object lesson in how to do research.
But this is the thing to me. There's so much more credible stuff that why make it up? Right? Well, why make it up? So
some people like to sell books, some people like to sell documentaries, and also it, as you say, it serves a narrative sometimes because they're trying to push something else, and without that, they can't then tell that story. So there's a lot of that goes on.
Right, the Corey Goods and
I guess so. But and then of course, just because people like to tell and like to become famous for being, the person who found this out, if you like, because I've been given this information. I can't tell you who it's from, but it tells a story. We've got people like that all over the place, and of course, not just in ufology. It's in different subjects, across history. Then you have people that come out of the woodwork and say, "I know something you don't," and it gives them fame, fortune, sometimes, and notoriety as well. So
and people are allured to that.
Of course they are.
Right? They're allured to it's something about them, and especially our community,
Yeah,
where
but it
we are
also but it
allured
also
to
aligns to
mystery.
it aligns to people's worldviews occasionally as
Yes,
well. So some people will think a certain thing, and because that matches what they think, they're more readily
that's
able to
evidence
believe
for
it
them.
than somebody else would be. Because yeah, it's added evidence, and
It's it's
it sits nicely to where they're going or what they're thinking about. But because they don't do the due diligence, they don't see that actually what they're sort of hanging their hat on is full of holes. It just doesn't stand up to scrutiny.
well,
Whereas, I try to be as objective as possible. Yes, okay, I'm interested in the subject, but for me, there's no sacred cows. And also, I'll just give a caveat to all the stuff I've said before. If somebody comes out tomorrow with a kind of cast iron, guaranteed bit of evidence that says, actually, Graeme, you're completely wrong, these things did exist, then I'll be the first person to put my hands up and say, do you know what? I was wrong. This then proves it. But I've not seen that information, and I can only go on what's available now.
I can I'm reaching my hand out to shake yours and say that it takes a big, you know what? I've always said that myself. If someone currently the MH370
Oh
videos and
yeah, yeah.
all that kind of stuff, and I had Ashton on, and it was interesting, and
Mm.
but the story is full of holes, and ultimately, as of right now, I don't believe it, and I think there's
Yeah.
um I don't know. I don't even
I
know
mean, the
where I'm.
things when you go back to the Glocker, you see the things which are true are the Germans did build underground factories because they had to, because their surface stuff, the aircraft factories, ball bearing factories, they were getting bombed out of existence. So they did, first of all, they started to kind of disperse everything into smaller factories and garage workshops and all the rest of it. They subcontracted out a lot of stuff, but then they realized that it was easier just to build things underground. So they were building rockets, they were building aircraft underground, they were building all kinds of munitions and stuff in underground facilities, a lot of the time built with slave labor, but
Yes,
they were building them. But a lot of them weren't available at the end of the war because they still weren't finished. And the
right.
ones that were, they weren't operating to anywhere like the kind of capacity they did. So that side of things is true. But then when you start hanging these other bits on them to say, oh, well, they were building this, they were building that in these places, that's where it gets a bit woolly. And that's when the kind of the evidence dries up. In terms of the Foo Fighters, there were two things that an Italian author came up with. He wrote the book originally in about 1956, but was never published until 68. And he comes up with these two, what they call aerial flak mines. So they're things that basically sniff out engine exhausts and are attracted to it. And then they're supposed to interfere with the ignition systems of aircraft and drop them out the skies that way. And he calls them Kugelblitz and Fireball. Ball Lightning Fighter and Fireball. That's the English names. And he's called Renato Vesco, this Italian guy. Now, this is again something else that you'll see all over the place, which are presented as fact, because people have read about this and they think that because he has all these footnotes in the book that he wrote about these things, that it must be true, because he reckons he's looked at research documents and all the rest of it. Again, it's one of these stories where, yes, the footnotes do relate to stuff that you can prove, but when he tries to actually give you evidence for these things that he's purporting to be these secret weapons that the Germans built, those references dry up completely. He doesn't have any evidence for them. So, it's again one of these stories where there's enough kind of truth there to build a story around, but when the story itself is false or it doesn't have supporting documentation. But everything else sounds great, so why isn't that bit true? And people who aren't maybe capable of this extra little leap in terms of, looking to see, well, is that true or is that not true? They've just accepted all as being fact. But actually, if you look a bit closely, you'll see, where it just you can't cover the bits that he's trying to sell the reader.
Gotcha.
And I read that book. I probably got a copy of that book something in about 1980, a long time ago. And I looked at this, and already I knew about virtually all the secret weapons programs that the Germans were building, or had planned, or this kind of thing. And I looked at this book and I thought, well, I've never come across these before. Actually, I had come across one of them, but for something completely different. The name was used for a tank which had an anti-aircraft gun on it. It was a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun called Kugelblitz, and that was the only name and actually place I'd ever come across that name. And I certainly hadn't come across it as as an aerial kind of mine, if you like. So
Right.
I knew there was something off straight away. And then just the more and more I looked into it, the less I found out. And I found a few people who had a similar kind of viewpoint, and they'd done a little bit more research than I had. So I was able to build on that as well. But then to counter that, you just saw person after person coming up and parroting this stuff in whether it was magazines or in documentaries or in books. And you just like kind of like shake your head and think, oh, for God's sake, just read a bit more deeper into this stuff.
You would assume that when you're making these documentaries, like you'd have at least a couple people dedicated to like vetting, but they don't. It's all for entertainment, and that's the problem.
That's it. Yeah, that's it.
It
sounds good. It looks good. Well, just throw it out there.
Right. And I commend guys like James Fox because I think they do great work in their documentaries. And that's what I aspire to do. And I have been doing, like that's what I went to school for. This is what I want to do.
Good.
And this topic is one that intrigues me so much, but I want to fast forward a little bit, and I want to talk about the DC flyovers. Now,
so this is July 1952 you're talking about.
Yeah. So a lot of people, and we're going to get there, right? I think we might go over our sweet spot, but, and if so, we let me create a marker here actually, because I might edit this. I'll probably have to edit this out. 121. I just want to run something by you. If we do, because I think if you're open, I'd be willing to go another 30 minutes because I want to flesh
I've got about another 10 minutes if that's all right with you, Tyler. Sorry, but I can do something else another time if you like.
All right. Then let's just finish this now.
I was just sending you a message in the private chat. Sorry, but yeah.
Okay. So we'll end it. We'll end it with the flyovers. But I'm gonna label this as part 1. Would you still be open to original time and doing a part 2?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'll be happy with that. Sometime in April. Yeah, no problem.
And then we can get into like things like the Battle of Los Angeles, Phoenix Lights. And I have a huge thing that I want to run across to you, especially because you were, that's when you were getting interested. I have evidence or a lot of cases that happened between a certain period in 1973. And I want to talk to you about it because I think so between September and December of 1973, there was a surge. I don't think it was just in the United States, but I want to run some things by you.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah.
So we could do that in a later episode, but all right, cool. So 122.44. Okay. So the DC flyovers, a lot of people ask, well, why, if aliens are here, why don't they just land on the White House lawn? Well, in 1952, over 2 consecutive weekends, they practically did.
Almost, yeah.
Could you? And again, if I was a UFO, I'm not going to land on the lawn. I'm not trying to get killed, but I will pass over. And I think this is a huge, huge moment. And I don't think it's one of these more credible stories that you hear about all the time, but gets played down. This is a huge event.
It was for the time, yeah, because things have been ramping up to that point anyway. The kind of momentum for kind of flying saucer sightings was just building from 1947 to the point of where it was being discussed by pretty much everybody. Everybody had an idea, had some knowledge of all this stuff that was appearing in the newspapers because they were picking up on every sighting that was going, whether it was from people on the ground, just ordinary people, ordinary walks of life, or whether there were military pilots. Until they put the kind of block on pilots talking about the sightings. But airliner pilots were seeing them as well. So there was a lot of sightings up to this point in July 1952. And as you say, over 2 successive weekends, so we're talking about the 19th of July and the 26th of July, over Washington, D.C., there was all these radar contacts. But also they weren't just on radar. The pilots were seeing these kind of points of light in the sky, which corresponded to these radar contacts on the screen at Washington National Airport. And nobody knew what they were. And in one of the early parts of the story, the tower basically asked one of the airline pilots who was in the circuit or just taken off, can you have a look to see what this thing is that they'd seen, and also it was on radar. And he said, yeah, I can see something, but I don't know what it is. So this is the kind of thing that happened. And the controllers didn't know what was happening. They'd never seen anything like this. They knew what radar angels were like, these kind of spurious echoes that appear on a radar system. They were
these
really
false
highly,
tracks.
yeah, but they were highly trained. And of course, it was a big position of responsibility to be on such a large airport in a major city.
Well, not just a major city.
The capital, yeah.
But
let's just say any major city with a big airport. So
right.
whether it was Los Angeles or whether it's San Francisco or New York or
Boston,
Washington, you're going to have a big team of controllers who are very well, they're very well trained, they're experienced, they know all the little foibles of their area and what's picked up and what comes up on the radar and all this kind of stuff. They're not going to be fooled by something that you could explain as just a temperature inversion, because that was what the Air Force came up and said they basically were, that they were just seeing something that was produced by a strange fluke of nature, if you like. But in the meantime, over these 2 weekends, these lights in the sky were being seen, but also on the radar. Now, it took the Air Force quite a long time to respond. They were told pretty much straight away by the staff at Washington National that something was happening. And could you look as well? So this is just across, I think it was Andrews Air Force Base, or Andrews Field, as it was called then, that some of the staff there were asked, can you see what's happening? And some of them were seeing some of the lights in the sky as well from a distance. So it wasn't as if, things were happening in isolation, and people on the ground were seeing things as well. And it just culminated in the Air Force eventually sending jets from Delaware, because that was the nearest active Air Force base. And it took them a little while to get there. I think it was something like 3 hours after the first reports before the first jets got on the scene. And of course, when they turned up, the contacts melted away. And as soon as the jets turned back for fuel to land for refueling, because they didn't have that much fuel on board in those days, they couldn't stay up for that for very long. As soon as they left the area, the contacts came back. So they were basically playing cat and mouse with the jet fighters.
Were any pictures ever released of this?
No.
And I wanted to clear that up, because
there is a famous picture. There is a famous picture, but it's wrong, because they're basically reflections of the lights of the street lights.
Yeah, you were on
it's the one I think you're talking to. You're talking about there.
You went on a podcast, and I love that podcast, run by Jason, and but he had talked about the picture. And I was like, well, that picture actually wasn't real. So there's no actual pictures of the event.
Not as far as I'm aware, no.
But there's very much so credibility in the witnesses and the several
radar controllers. Was also there was a spokesman for the Air Force from the Pentagon. A guy called Al Chop was around. He was there. He was the one that ushered all the reporters out of the room when things were getting a bit more hectic. So you've got the pilots, so you've got airline pilots, you've got the jet fighter pilots who had also been interviewed by various people as well. So there's a whole kind of range of voices in terms of what was going on. But then after the second weekend, things came to a head, because it was quite clear that these things were flying over the airspace of Washington, over the Capitol, over the White House.
This is the most restricted.
Without
airspace.
Any kind of response being effective. The Air Force were effectively impotent, and questions were probably being asked as to, well, why can't you do something about this? Is this going to happen for a third week? But so there was a press conference called by the US Air Force, on the Monday morning after the second weekend, and there was various people dragged out. It was Major General Stanford, who was quite high up in intelligence. He was wheeled out, and he was the one. If you've ever seen the footage,
and he gives that speech.
He gives that kind of speech, about and he comes across quite unconvincing as well. That he's almost reading from a prompt kind of thing, and he's a bit stilted. But the press, when they were there, they lapped it all up because it was coming from an authoritative source. They had people who were experts in radar who were saying about these radar anomalies, well, there must be a temperature inversion, etc. Except they hadn't really looked at what was happening over those 2 weekends.
Wow.
So there was all this stuff going on, and the press basically bought it. So it took some of the heat out of the situation, and I don't think they ever had the same kind of, not interest, that's the wrong word, just the same kind of conviction about the source of stories afterwards. They still reported them and still report them on numbers, but there wasn't that same, what's going on? We need to know what's happening.
Right.
Is there something to it? We get,
Right.
people are getting scared out there. And I think it's been building up to that up until those 2 weekends and then a press conference. And the Air Force basically just took all the heat out of the situation and deflected some of the attention away from themselves.
Yeah, it's the Phoenix Lights, scenario. It's what would let them, or it trained them on the Phoenix Lights when the town or city basically came, screaming for answers.
Well, they just said military flares and A-10s, didn't they? Something like that. So
yeah,
they have a prosaic explanation, which sounds good, and it does tick a lot of boxes.
Yeah,
and to a lot of people, it makes complete sense. But
and we know, and in an episode, our next episode, we'll get into Project Sign and Project Grudge, because I think there's so much to talk about with you, and Project Sign, Project Grudge, which would eventually become Project Blue Book, which would be basically.
It was a public relations exercise for the U.S. Air Force to do with UFOs.
Yeah,
that's what it ended up as anyway.
But done so deliberately to stigmatize and
after a while, definitely
to ridicule the citizens and really create that hostile environment for reporting, because you didn't want to be labeled a crazy or get your, in pilots' cases, they didn't want to get their wings taken away or go see the shrink for, a 48-hour eval. So it really, that's when the military industrial complex really institutes the stigma around the topic. And I want to talk more about you about that. But your latest book, you focused on 1956 and
1955 and 1956, yeah.
Sorry, 1956. God. 1955 and 1956.
That's correct.
And the book is incredible. But all your books are available on Amazon. But maybe you could tell us more about just what the books are, what you're aiming to do, and where they can find you on social media.
Okay, so after I wrote UFOs Before Roswell, which was the book about the Foo Fighters, I then embarked on it's now turned into a long-running series of books about aerial UFO encounters. And I picked kind of specific years. So the first book, which was Dawn of the Flying Saucers, was from 1946 to 1949. It tells a story of not just aerial sightings, but also the US Air Force's kind of response to these. So the setting up, if you like, of Project Sign, Project Grudge. And then the next book was Flying Saucer Fever, which dealt with 50 to 52, which, funny enough, has a forward from Lou Elizondo as well, so he contributed to the book. So it tells a similar story, but for those years. And then the next one was Intercept and Identify, which was 1953 and 1954. And then the latest books that you just mentioned there is Chasing Shadows, with a forward by Bryce Zabel. And that's 55 and 56. So it's really quite it makes it much easier for the reader to get an appreciation for those particular years without being a huge book, because I try to throw the kitchen sink at in terms of the amount of information to do with each case. Everything I can find, I present, rather than just a kind of summation of a case, which is sometimes in books you'll see it take maybe a couple of paragraphs if you're lucky, sometimes a page if you're really lucky. I try to give you everything so you can make your own mind up about what happened, because the more information that people have, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
And you have been an absolutely amazing guest. I am enthralled, and I don't want to end the conversation, but
Sure.
it looks like this will just be part one.
Good.
Part one, and thank you for coming here and spending some time with my audience. And total disclosure, Graeme, I consider you a friend now of the show, and we really look forward to having you back on, because I think this is a great conversation, and I really want to start diving into the history, because again, we said it at the start. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome, right? So we really need to study our past in order to understand what's going to happen in the future, or what's, so we don't make the same mistakes, at
Yep.
least,
Very
and
true.
learning from it. So you are absolutely a leading authority in my mind on this this realm, and I really look forward to having you back on. And for everybody listening, I want to say thank you to you as well. You guys keep the show going, especially the members who contribute to the show. If it wasn't for you, we wouldn't be doing it, or couldn't be doing it. I would do this even if zero people, like if nobody listened, I would still do this. I love it. I'm a collector of stories, Graeme. That's what I am. And for everyone out there, let you know what it is. And we'll see you next time. Thank you again, Graeme.
Thanks very much, Tyler. Cheers.
Cheers.